At 3:17 in the morning, a dying man grabbed a nurse's wrist and whispered four words that changed everything. The soldier's grip was iron despite the blood soaking through 3 layers of bandage, despite the fact that his heart had flatlined twice in the past hour. His eyes found hers across the chaos of the trauma bay. Not the attending physician's eyes, not the charge nurse's, not the security officer standing near the door. Hers. And what he said next was not meant for any of them. It was meant only for someone who would know exactly what it meant. Someone who was supposed to no longer exist. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit that follow button, give it a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The night shift at Harlow Ridge Medical Center was the kind of quiet that made experienced nurses nervous. Not peaceful quiet, not the low hum of a hospital finding its rhythm at 2 in the morning, the soft beeping of monitors, the occasional squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. This was the tight, held-breath quiet that came right before something went wrong. The kind that settled into your bones before the radio crackled, before the ambulance bay doors slammed open, before the whole floor shifted from routine into controlled disaster. Nora Voss felt it at 3:09 a.m. She was standing at the nurse's station on Trauma 2, finishing a medication log she'd been trying to complete for 40 minutes, and she paused without knowing why. Pen still against the paper, eyes drifting toward the ambulance entrance at the far end of the corridor. A small, involuntary stillness came over her, the kind her body produced sometimes without asking her permission, a leftover reflex from a life she didn't live anymore. She shook it off and went back to the log. Nora Voss was 29 years old, 5'6", with the kind of face people forgot easily. Brown hair pulled back tight, no jewelry during shifts, movements economical, never wasted. She'd been working Trauma 2 at Harlow Ridge for 2 years, and in that time she had become the kind of nurse that senior physicians overlooked at rounds, that administrators forgot to include in department emails, that newer staff assumed was some kind of mid-level because she never raised her voice and never, not once, appeared rattled by anything the night threw at her. What they saw was a quiet young woman doing a competent job. What they didn't see, what nobody on that floor saw, was the discipline underneath it. The way her eyes moved when she walked into a room, door, windows, exits, threats. The way she cataloged every patient's vitals not just as numbers but as a situation, a set of variables she was already solving. The way her hands never shook, not even during the bad nights, the nights when other nurses went to the break room afterward and sat down hard. 2 years at Harlow Ridge, and she had rebuilt herself so thoroughly that sometimes she almost believed the version of herself she'd become. Almost. At 3:14, her radio crackled. Trauma 2, incoming, male, approximately 40, multiple GSWs to the torso and right thigh, BP 60 over palp, tachy at 1:30, ETA 3 minutes. This one's a mess, people. Nora was already moving before the dispatcher finished the sentence. She pulled her gloves from her pocket as she walked, snapping them on with a practiced motion. She hit the supply room for a second trauma kit, did a fast inventory. Chest seals, hemostatic gauze, large bore IVs, pressure bags, and had everything staged at Bay 3 by the time the ambulance backed in. The paramedics came through fast. The man on the gurney was in bad shape. That was the only honest way to put it. He was large, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of build that suggested years of physical conditioning. But right now his size was working against him, his heart working harder than it could sustain to push blood through a body that was losing it faster than they could replace it. His shirt had been cut away by the paramedics. 3 entry wounds were visible. 2 left lateral chest, 1 right thigh, tourniquet already in place and dark with blood. His face was gray-white, that particular emptied-out pallor that told you the body had already started making decisions about what to prioritize. "What have we got?" Dr. Elliot Crane, the attending on duty, arrived at the bay pulling on his gloves, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had been important in rooms for a long time. The lead paramedic ran the report, found him in the parking structure off Glenmore, called in by a security guard. No ID on him. 2 bystanders tried to apply pressure, but both wounds to the chest were sucking. We sealed them en route, got 1 line in the field, lost it in the rig. BP keeps bottoming out. "Get me 2 large bore IVs, bilateral antecubital," Crane said, and the team moved. Nora was already at the patient's right arm, tourniquet in hand. She had his vein in 3 seconds flat, the kind of stick that came from doing it 1,000 times in conditions considerably worse than a well-lit trauma bay. She taped it down, connected the pressure bag, and stepped around to get eyes on his chest seals. The left side seals looked right, but something about the breath sounds when she leaned in, a wet, slightly off-rhythm quality on the right side, made her pause. She looked up. "Dr. Crane, can we get bilateral breath sounds confirmed? I'm hearing something uneven on the right." Crane was at the patient's head, focused on airway. He didn't look up. "Let's get him stabilized first, Voss." She held her position for a moment. The sound was there. She knew what it meant. "I can have a thoracostomy kit." "Voss." His voice had an edge to it now. "I've got the airway. You've got the lines. Let's stay in our lanes." The other nurses in the bay exchanged glances. Not at Nora, at each other. The small, practiced non-communication of people who had seen this specific dynamic play out before. Nora went back to the lines. She hung the second bag and watched the pressure readout. Still bottom floor. She calculated fluid rate, cross-checked the medication orders Crane was calling out, and waited, the way she had learned in a different life to wait for the right moment rather than the convenient one. 40 seconds later, the patient's O2 sat dropped to 83, and his blood pressure bottomed out completely. "Tension pneumo," Nora said. Not a question. This time Crane heard the urgency in her voice and looked at the monitor. For a single second, his face did the thing faces do when they realize they should have listened 30 seconds ago. "Needle decompression, right second ICS," he said. She had the needle in her hand before he finished saying it. The release of pressure was immediate, the characteristic rush, the patient's chest rising differently, the monitor beginning its slow recovery. She held the needle steady, watching the numbers climb back toward survivable, and did not say a single word about the fact that she had told him. By 350, the patient was in marginally better shape, still critical, still losing blood faster than they wanted, but breathing, with a pressure that could be worked with. Crane ordered him to surgery, and the OR team arrived to take over. Nora was stripping her gloves at the supply cart when the patient's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. She froze. His eyes were open. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected him to be conscious at all, but he was looking at her with a focus that didn't belong in a man who'd been coding 8 minutes ago. His grip was weak, trembling, but deliberate. He had chosen her specifically. His lips moved. She leaned in. "Tell them..." His voice was barely there, a dry, ruined sound. "Tell them the medic from Coldwater Ridge is still alive." She went very still. He held her gaze for another second, something passing between them that she couldn't fully name, and then his eyes closed and the OR team wheeled him away, and the trauma bay was just a trauma bay again, with the ordinary sounds of equipment being reset and nurses making notes and Elliot Crane saying something into his phone in the corridor. Nora stood at the cart for a long moment. Coldwater Ridge, she hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in almost 5 years. She finished her shift documentation on autopilot. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, log entries, equipment checks, handoff notes for the day shift, while some other part of her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere cold and dark and too specific to be memory alone. Coldwater Ridge was the name of a classified operation. A joint special operations mission that had gone sideways in ways that weren't supposed to be possible, given the planning that had gone into it, given the people involved. 4 soldiers had been left behind in the extraction. 3 of them had been recovered, eventually, through channels that were never publicly discussed. The 4th was listed as killed in action, remains unrecovered. She knew this because she had been the combat medic on that mission. Before Harlow Ridge Medical Center and Trauma 2 and the quiet, unremarkable life she had built with considerable care, Nora Voss had been Staff Sergeant Nora Voss, U.S. Army Special Operations Medical Sergeant, attached to a unit whose name wasn't on any public record. 3 combat deployments, 47 documented life saves in field conditions, classified commendations she wasn't allowed to keep in her service file, then Coldwater Ridge, and the aftermath, and the medical discharge, and the slow, deliberate work of becoming someone who didn't exist in any database that mattered. She had not thought about the name of that mission in a long time. Now a man who apparently knew it had grabbed her wrist and spoken it in a hospital trauma bay at 3 in the morning, and she didn't think that was a coincidence. She didn't believe in coincidences the way she used to. That particular belief had been trained out of her. She was in the break room staring at a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk when her colleague Priya sat down across from her. "You okay?" Priya asked. She had that careful tone people used when they meant the opposite, when they actually meant something specific had happened and they weren't sure how to name it. "Fine," Nora said. "Long night. Crane was being an ass again." "Crane is always being an ass. That's not news." Priya tilted her head. "The patient said something to you, didn't he, when he grabbed your wrist?" Nora looked at her. Priya was sharp. One of the better nurses on the floor, the kind of person who noticed things. Under different circumstances, Nora would have appreciated that about her. "He was barely conscious," Nora said. "It wasn't coherent." It was the kind of answer that was technically accurate and completely misleading at the same time. She had learned to construct those carefully. At 6:45 a.m., when the day shift was coming on and the night staff was doing final handoffs, a man Nora had never seen before walked into the unit. He was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a plain jacket, the kind of deliberately unremarkable outfit that people in certain professions chose specifically because it didn't stand out. But the way he moved was not civilian. The controlled economy of motion, the way his eyes covered the room in a single sweep before he'd taken 3 steps through the door, the positioning of his hands, all of it was trained. She recognized it the way she would recognize a dialect she'd grown up speaking. He went to the nurse's station and spoke to the charge nurse, Paula Drummond, in a low voice. Paula's expression went through 2 or 3 visible changes before settling on careful compliance. The expression of a woman who had just been shown something that told her she didn't have a choice. Then Paula looked across the floor toward the break room. Nora was already closing her coffee cup into the trash. She took the long way back to the locker room through the supply corridor because the long way had a window that looked down into the ambulance bay. From that window, she could see 2 vehicles she hadn't noticed arriving. A dark SUV with government plates, and parked slightly further back, a nondescript white van with no markings that she was willing to bet had considerably more equipment in it than a plumbing supply run would require. 3 people standing near the vehicles, not looking at their phones, not talking, just standing. She changed out of her scrubs, put on the civilian clothes she kept in her locker, and was thinking about her exits when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered it anyway. "Staff Sergeant Voss." The voice used a rank she hadn't held in years. She said nothing. "We need you to stay in the building," the voice said. It was male, measured, not unkind, the tone of someone delivering information rather than making a request. "The patient you treated tonight is connected to an active federal investigation. Someone from our team will come to speak with you." "I'm a nurse," she said. "I treated a patient. That's all I did." "We know what you did, Sergeant. We also know what he said to you." She stood in the locker room for a moment with the phone against her ear, listening to the particular silence of someone waiting to see what she would do next. "I'll be in the cafeteria," she said. She hung up. The cafeteria at Harlow Ridge opened at 7, and by 7:15 it was the usual controlled chaos of shift changes and tired staff and visiting family members who had been in the waiting room all night. Nora took a table near the window, with her back to the wall and a clear line of sight to both entrances, and drank the first cup of coffee she'd actually tasted all morning. She was on her second when Dr. Crane walked in. He wasn't looking for coffee. He spotted her immediately, something she noted because it meant he'd been told where she was, and crossed the cafeteria with the purposeful stride of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was ultimately her fault. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking and sat down. "The patient from Bay 3, he said. "GSW, came in around 3:15. "I remember," she said. "Military investigators are on the floor, CID, apparently." He said the acronym with the particular irritation of a civilian physician who found outside agencies in his hospital profoundly inconvenient. "They want to talk to everyone who had contact with him." He paused. "Including you." "I'm aware." "They're also asking questions about what the patient said during treatment." His eyes on hers were careful. "Did he say anything to you specifically, Voss?" This was the moment, she noted, when a certain kind of person would decide whether to tell the truth or not, and then decide based on who they were talking to. She had a fairly good read on who Elliot Crane was. He was semi-conscious during most of the treatment, she said. He said something when he grabbed my wrist at the end, but it wasn't intelligible. Crane held her gaze for a moment. He didn't believe her. She could see that clearly. But he also didn't have enough to push, and he knew it. "The hospital administrator wants to speak with you today," he said. "Doris Fenton. There's a concern about protocol, specifically around you calling for the thoracostomy kit before I ordered it." There it was. She had been waiting for something like this. The institutional response to a situation that made someone important uncomfortable. She had seen it before, in a different uniform, in a different context. "I suggested a procedure based on patient presentation," she said. "You made the call. That's how the chain of command works. What you did was question my assessment in front of the team. What I did was ask you to consider a clinical possibility." She picked up her coffee cup. "The monitor confirmed tension pneumo 90 seconds after I mentioned it." Crane's jaw tightened. This was the part he hated. Not being wrong exactly, but being demonstrably wrong in a way that was documented and witnessed. Physicians with Crane's particular architecture of self-image had a specific way of dealing with that. "Fenton wants you in her office at 10, he said. He stood, straightening his coat. "And the investigators want everyone who treated the patient to stay available today." He walked away without waiting for a response. Nora watched him go. She understood what was happening. The meeting with Fenton wasn't about the thoracostomy suggestion. That was just the lever. The real question was what she knew, and whether she was someone they needed to manage before she said it to the wrong people. She had been managed before. It hadn't gone particularly well for the people who tried it. She met with the CID agent in a small conference room off the administrative wing at 8:30. His name was Decker. He told her that, just the single name, in the way people in specific roles sometimes did. Mid-40s, compact, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent a lot of years in rooms like this one, asking questions like these. "Ms. Voss," he said. He used the civilian address deliberately, she thought. "I appreciate you staying." "Of course," she said. "The man you treated tonight is named Thomas War. Does that name mean anything to you?" She considered this honestly. War. She turned the name over, checking it against things she knew, faces she remembered. "No," she said. "Should it?" "He's active duty Army, Special Operations Command." Decker watched her face while he said it. "He was transporting classified documentation when he was shot. The documentation is missing." "I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "I treated his wounds. I didn't see any documentation." "We're not suggesting you did." A pause. "He said something to you before he went to the OR." She kept her expression neutral. Not the blankness that telegraphed effort, just the ordinary face of someone who was thinking carefully. "He was in and out of consciousness. He said something, but it wasn't—" "Ms. Voss," Decker leaned forward very slightly. "I want to be straightforward with you, because I think it'll save us both time." He paused. "We know about your service record." The cafeteria noise was faintly audible through the wall. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was laughing. "I was honorably discharged," she said. "You were. And your record before the discharge was significant." He chose the word carefully. "The reason I'm being direct with you is that what Thomas War was transporting is connected to an investigation that's been running for 18 months. And what he said to you, whatever he said, might be the most important thing he communicated to anyone." She sat with that for a moment. The professional calculus was this. She could keep running the play she'd been running for 5 years. The quiet civilian, the unremarkable nurse, the woman who didn't know anything and didn't remember anything. That play had worked. It had given her 2 years at Harlow Ridge and a life that was modest and functional and entirely without the particular kind of weight she used to carry. Or she could tell him what War had said, what those 4 words meant, what they pointed toward. "Coldwater Ridge," she said. Decker went very still. "That's what he said. Tell them the medic from Coldwater Ridge is still alive." She met the agent's eyes. "I don't know who he meant by them, but I know what Coldwater Ridge is. Ms. Voss, because I was there," she said. "I was the medic." The silence after that was different from the ones before it. This one had weight in it, the kind of silence that happened when a room understood that something had just shifted in a fundamental way. Decker took a slow breath. He reached into his jacket and produced his phone, angled it toward him, tapped something. When he looked back up, his expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "The investigation we're running," he said. "Coldwater Ridge is at the center of it." She didn't make it to the meeting with Doris Fenton at 10. At 9:40, she was still in the conference room with Decker, going through the framework of what she remembered about the mission. Not details, not yet. She wasn't ready to go there without understanding what she was walking into. When the door opened without a knock, and Paula Drummond stepped in. Paula looked at Nora first, then at the agent, then back at Nora, with the expression of someone delivering news they weren't happy to carry. "I'm sorry," Paula said. "Fenton wants you now. She says it can't wait." Decker started to say something, but Nora had already read Paula's face completely. She stood. "I'll be back," she told the agent. The walk to Fenton's office was on the 4th floor, and on the way, she passed the window overlooking the ambulance bay again. The SUV was still there. The white van was not. Doris Fenton was 61, had been the chief administrative officer of Harlow Ridge for 11 years, and had a particular skill for making rooms feel smaller than they were. She was standing when Nora came in, which meant she wasn't planning to offer her a seat, which meant this was already something specific. Also in the room, Elliot Crane against the far wall, and a woman Nora didn't recognize. Late 40s, a tailored jacket, the kind of composed stillness that came from practice. She introduced herself as Judith Hale with Harlow Ridge's legal department. "Ms. Voss," Fenton said, "thank you for coming. Please sit down." There was only one chair positioned in front of the desk. Nora sat. "I'll be direct," Fenton said. "The events of this morning have created some significant concerns. The patient you treated has apparently made statements that are now central to a federal investigation, and your name is being associated with that investigation in a way that the hospital finds problematic." "I treated a patient," Nora said. "I'd like to understand what's problematic about that." "What's problematic," Crane said from the wall, "is that you apparently had a prior connection to this individual that you didn't disclose." She looked at him. "I didn't have a prior connection to him. I've never seen him before tonight." "You knew information that was classified, Ms. Hale said, her voice careful and measured. "Information that was—" "I have security clearance from a previous service commitment," Nora said, "which is a matter of record. If there are questions about my clearance, those questions should be directed to the relevant federal agency." She paused. "Which, as I understand it, currently has an agent in your conference room on the 2nd floor. Fenton's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Your clearance isn't the issue," Fenton said. "The issue is the clinical conduct. Dr. Crane has documented that during the treatment of this patient, you repeatedly pressured him to order procedures that were outside the existing plan of care." There it was, fully assembled now, the specific shape of what they were doing. She could see the whole architecture of it, Crane's documentation, Hale present to handle anything legal, Fenton positioned as the administrative authority. They were going to put the clinical issue on paper before the federal investigation could go anywhere. "I made a clinical observation," Nora said. "Dr. Crane made the call. Your behavior was disruptive to the treatment team. The patient is alive." She said it simply. "The needle decompression I suggested, that Crane ordered, is the reason his pressure came back. If you'd like to pull the monitor logs, the timing is documented." "That's not the—" Crane started. "What this hospital chooses to document and what the monitor logs actually show," Nora said, "are two different things. I'd be careful about which one you want to put in writing, because right now there are federal investigators in your building who are going to look at everything." The room went quiet, in the specific way of people recalibrating. Fenton looked at Hale, a small, contained exchange of signals. "Ms. Voss," Fenton said finally, her voice carrying the surface temperature of measured professionalism, "we're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a review of this morning's events. This is standard procedure during federal inquiries." "Understood," Nora said. She stood, straightened her jacket, and looked at each of the 3 people in the room in turn. Not with anger, not with any particular emotion at all, just looked the way she had learned to look at things she needed to remember. Then she walked out. She went back to the locker room, retrieved her bag, sat on the bench for a moment in the silence. Administrative leave, federal investigators, Coldwater Ridge. She pulled out her phone and looked at it for a long moment. There was someone she could call, someone who might still have the right clearances, who owed her something from a long time ago, who knew things about that mission that had never made it into any report. She'd kept the number all this time out of some instinct she hadn't been able to fully explain to herself. She was still looking at the phone when the locker room door opened. It wasn't Paula. It wasn't Decker. It was a man in Army service uniform. Class B, no rack of ribbons visible from where she sat, but the insignia of CID on his collar. And behind him, a woman in civilian clothes who moved the way Decker moved, which told Nora she was also federal. The man in uniform looked at her for a moment. His expression went through something complicated. "Staff Sergeant Voss," he said. He was mid-50s, with a face that had been through considerable weather. "My name is Harlan Merritt. I'm with the Army Criminal Investigation Division, working jointly with the Department of Justice." He paused. "We've been looking for you for almost a year." Nora stayed very still. "I'm on administrative leave," she said. "The hospital just told me We know what the hospital told you." Something crossed his face. Not anger, but the close cousin of it. "Thomas War, the man you treated tonight. He was carrying a drive. It's missing, but before it went missing, he transmitted a copy to a secure DOJ server." Merritt stepped further into the room, the civilian agent holding position near the door. "The drive contains documentation, records from a joint operation 5 years ago. The air in the room changed. She didn't move. The documentation names people," Merritt said. "Contractors, officers, physicians who provided falsified medical assessments that were used to cover what happened during that mission." He held her gaze. "The mission you were on, Sergeant? Coldwater Ridge." The bench was solid under her. She was aware of that in the deliberate, conscious way you became aware of your physical surroundings when your mind was trying to move too fast. "There are people in this hospital," Merritt said quietly, "who are connected to that cover-up. People who knew you were here and didn't want you talking to investigators. People who, as of about 45 minutes ago, know that War spoke to you before he went into surgery." She thought about the white van that had been in the ambulance bay and wasn't there anymore. She thought about Judith Hale, the legal representative who had been in that room too quickly, too prepared. "How many?" she said. "At minimum? 2. Merritt paused. "Possibly 3. She looked down at her phone. Then she looked back up at Harlan Merritt, and she said the thing she had not said to anyone in 5 years. "Tell me what you need from me." He nodded slowly, like a man who had been carrying a question for a long time and had finally gotten the answer he came for. "We need everything you remember about Coldwater Ridge," he said, "and we need you to understand that the people who tried to bury that mission have known where you were for 6 months." The locker room was very quiet. Outside the building, somewhere below, a door slammed, or it might have been a vehicle. It was hard to tell from where she was sitting, and the difference mattered considerably. She put her phone in her bag. "All right," she said, "let's start from the beginning." Harlan Merritt didn't sit down. He stood near the door of the locker room with his arms loose at his sides, the way people stood when they were used to rooms that could go bad quickly. And he looked at Nora like a man who had revised his expectations of this conversation several times before she'd said yes. "The beginning," he said. "All right. How much of what you filed after the discharge was accurate?" "All of it," she said. "Everything in the official report was what I witnessed. The problem wasn't accuracy. The problem was what got cut." "What got cut?" "My original debrief was 47 pages. What went into the file was 11. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back up. "I pushed back. I was told the redactions were classified. Then I was told my psych eval raised concerns about my fitness for duty. Then I was medically discharged." She paused. "It happened fast. Faster than those processes usually move." Merritt exchanged a look with the civilian agent by the door, a woman who had introduced herself as Rollins, DOJ, and had not said another word since. Something passed between them. "We have the original 47 pages," Merritt said. Nora went still. "War got them out. Before he was shot, he transmitted the complete debrief file, your file, along with 3 other documents we've been trying to recover for 14 months. Merritt pulled a chair from the corner of the locker room and sat down heavily, like a man whose legs had made a decision his composure hadn't caught up to. "We didn't know if you were still in the country. Your trail went cold in Portland 2.5 years ago." "I moved," she said simply. "You move very carefully," Rollins said from the door, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. Nora didn't respond to that. She was thinking about the 47 pages, about what was in them, the things she had written down in the raw, unfiltered hours after the extraction, before anyone had told her what she was and wasn't allowed to say, the things she had been almost certain she was the only living person who still knew. "What else was in the file he transmitted?" she said. "Financial records, contract documentation from a private defense contractor called Varick Solutions, and medical assessments, specifically post-mission medical evaluations for 12 soldiers from the Coldwater Ridge unit." Merritt's voice stayed even, but the effort was visible. "Those evaluations were signed by a physician. They were used to demonstrate that the soldiers left behind during extraction were non-recoverable, that the decision to extract without them met the standard for battlefield necessity." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once and steadied. "Those assessments were falsified," Nora said. It wasn't a question. 3 of the 4 soldiers left behind were alive at the time of extraction. We can prove that now. He held her gaze. War was one of them. He survived. He spent 4 years documenting what happened before he had enough to go to CYD. She thought about Thomas War on the gurney, his grip on her wrist, the absolute specificity of what he'd said to her, the way he'd picked her out of the room, the way he'd held on with a hand that should not have had any strength left in it at all. "Who signed the assessments?" she said. Merritt reached into his jacket. He produced a single printed page, a photograph of a document, the quality grainy, clearly a scan of a scan. He held it out to her. She took it and looked at the signature at the bottom. The name was Dr. Elliot Crane. She sat with that for longer than she expected to. Crane. His particular brand of condescension, the way he'd dismissed her suggestion in the trauma bay, the speed with which he'd appeared in Fenton's office that morning. She had read it as professional arrogance, the ordinary institutional reflex of a physician who didn't like being questioned by someone beneath his rank. But it wasn't that. Or it wasn't only that. He had recognized her name. He must have. The moment she appeared in the staff roster, or maybe earlier, maybe when she'd applied, maybe someone had flagged it. And he had done what men in his position did when something threatened them. He had made sure she stayed small and invisible and easily dismissed, so that if she ever surfaced as a problem, the groundwork was already laid. She handed the document back to Merritt. "He tried to have me removed from the case this morning," she said, "before I'd spoken to anyone, before I even knew what was happening." "We know," Rollins said. "We've been monitoring his communications for 6 weeks. Then you know he called someone after I left Fenton's office." Merritt nodded slowly. "He called a number registered to a logistics subsidiary of Varick Solutions. The call lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Long enough to tell someone that the medic from Coldwater Ridge was sitting in Harlow Ridge Medical Center and had just been talked to by Thomas War. Long enough to make certain decisions about what needed to happen next." "I need to know," Nora said carefully, "whether War is still in this building." "He's in the OR," Rollins said. "He's been in surgery for 2 hours." "Then he's accessible," Nora said, "to anyone with a hospital ID." The room got very quiet. Merritt was on his feet before she finished the sentence, phone already out. "Mom." It took 11 minutes to get a federal protective detail to the OR wing, which was 11 minutes during which Nora sat in the locker room with Rollins and said very little, because there was nothing useful to say. She had learned a long time ago that the waiting periods between decisions were not the time to talk. They were the time to think, to map out the variables you could see and account for the ones you couldn't, to resist the temptation to fill silence with words that would only have to be unsaid later. What she was thinking about was Doris Fenton. Fenton had moved fast this morning, faster than an administrator should have, if this were simply a routine concern about clinical conduct. The meeting had been scheduled before Crane had time to file anything formal. Judith Hale from legal had been present, which meant the decision to have legal representation in the room had been made before Nora walked in. Someone had decided the shape of that meeting before it happened. Either Fenton was connected to the same network as Crane, or someone had called her the way Crane had called Varick Solutions, and she had responded by doing what administrators did. She had tried to neutralize the problem through institutional channels before it could become something that required a different kind of response. Administrative leave was a clean tool. It removed her from the building, removed her access, gave them a documented paper reason if anyone asked why she'd been excluded from conversations. It was the kind of move that looked procedural from the outside and was something else entirely from where she was standing. Merritt came back in at 10:23. "War is secure," he said. "We have 2 agents outside the OR, and we're moving him to a different facility as soon as he's stable enough to transport." He paused. "There was someone who attempted to access the OR wing about 20 minutes ago. Hospital employee ID, but the name doesn't match any active staff record. Security stopped them." "Who?" Nora said. ID said maintenance. Name on the card was Patterson. No Patterson in the hospital directory. She absorbed that. A false ID used quickly, within the window between Crane's phone call and the federal detail arriving. Someone had been in position already, close enough to move within 20 minutes of the call. That wasn't improvisation. That was a contingency plan that had already existed, waiting to be activated. "You need to pull Crane now," she said. "And Fenton." "We can't yet," Rollins said. "We pull them now without the full evidentiary package and the case fractures. The documents War transmitted are solid, but there are gaps. Crane's signature on the assessments proves he signed them. It doesn't yet prove he knew they were falsified." "He knew," Nora said. "I believe you," Rollins said. "That's not the same as being able to prove it in front of a federal judge." This was the part of investigations that Nora had always found hardest. The procedural necessity of letting something continue to exist while you built the case against it. It was not her natural instinct. Her training had run in the opposite direction. Identify the threat, neutralize it, secure the area. The legal scaffolding that federal investigators needed before they could move was something she understood intellectually and found genuinely difficult in practice. "What do you need from me?" she said again. It had become her question. "Your testimony," Merritt said. "Your original account of Coldwater Ridge on the record, with your signature from someone who was present during the mission. That fills the largest remaining gap in the case." He sat back down. "We also need you to stay in Hartwell County. Don't leave the area." "I'm on administrative leave," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "The leave may be the least of your concerns," Rollins said, and she said it in the tone of someone understating a thing on purpose. She drove home at 11:15 in the morning, which was the first time she'd been in her car since she'd driven to her shift the previous night, and the daylight felt wrong in the specific way it felt wrong when you'd been awake through it and it arrived anyway without your permission. Her apartment was 20 minutes from the hospital. She'd chosen it for that reason. Close enough to get to work quickly, not so close that she was embedded in the hospital's social geography, the bars and coffee shops where the night staff went after shifts, and everyone talked about everyone else. She had spent 2 years being someone slightly peripheral, slightly outside the inner orbit of Harlow Ridge's institutional life, and she had done it intentionally. She parked. She went upstairs. She made coffee. Then she sat at her kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long time. Thomas War had spent 4 years building a case, 4 years collecting documentation, surviving, staying under enough cover that he could keep moving without being found, all while carrying evidence that people with resources and reasons were actively trying to destroy. 4 years for a mission that had lasted 72 hours. A mission that had been classified at a level that meant most of the people who ordered it could deny it existed. And he had come to Harlow Ridge specifically. Not because it was close, not because it was the nearest trauma center. There were 2 other hospitals within equivalent distance of the parking structure where they'd found him. He had come here because she was here, the medic from Coldwater Ridge. She didn't know how he'd found her. She had been careful. But she understood now what he had been doing in those 4 minutes before she'd approached with the tourniquet and the trauma kit. He had been staying alive long enough to find her, to say those words, to pass the thread to the one person he was certain would know what to do with it. He had bet his survival on her being exactly who she used to be. She was still sitting with that when her phone rang. Unknown number again, but a different unknown than the morning. She had developed, over years of necessary paranoia, a practiced sense for which unknown numbers to answer. She picked up. Nora Voss? Not a question. A woman's voice, low, measured, with the clipped precision of someone who had been in military or law enforcement and retained the verbal habits. My name is Adrienne Farwell. I'm a Department of Justice attorney working with the task force that Merritt runs. He didn't mention you, Nora said. He doesn't know I'm calling. A pause. I wanted to speak with you before your formal deposition. There are things about this case that Merritt is not going to tell you up front, because he's focused on building the prosecution, and he needs your cooperation to do that. I'm calling because I think you deserve to understand the full scope of what you're walking into. Nora set down her coffee cup. I'm listening. The documents War transmitted, the financial records, the Varick Solutions contracts, they connect to people above Crane, significantly above him. Another pause, this one heavier. One of the names in those records is a current senior official at the Department of Defense, not a contractor, not a civilian advisor, active government. She said nothing. When I say your testimony fills the largest gap in the case, Farwell continued, what I mean specifically is that you are the only surviving witness who was on the ground during Coldwater Ridge, who has not been either discredited, disappeared, or brought inside the conspiracy. You are the last clean witness. Her voice stayed level. Which means that when this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, you are going to become the most important person in a case that involves people with significant interest in making you unimportant again. They had 6 months to find me, Nora said. They didn't act. They didn't know what War had until last night. Now they do. Farwell paused. I'm not calling to frighten you. I'm calling because the next 72 hours are going to be the most critical period of this entire investigation. And I think you should understand exactly what's at stake before you sit down with Merritt and start talking. Nora looked at her kitchen wall, at the ordinary, unremarkable apartment around her, the life she had assembled piece by piece, the coffee maker she'd bought on sale, the jacket on the hook by the door, the bookshelves of novels she read to sleep. What changed in the last 6 months, she said. You said they didn't know what War had. What did they know? They knew he was alive. They'd been looking for him. A beat. What they didn't know was that he'd built a complete evidentiary package. They thought he had partial documentation. Enough to be inconvenient, but not enough to be fatal. Last night changed that calculation. So Crane's call wasn't just about me, Nora said slowly. It was confirmation. War survived long enough to be treated, which meant he'd survived long enough to talk. And to transmit, Farwell said. Yes. She thought about the false maintenance I.D. Patterson. The 20-minute window before Merritt got security to the OR. Not just a contingency plan, a pre-positioned asset, someone already inside the building, waiting. How long has someone been inside Harlow Ridge, she said. The silence on the other end of the line was 3 seconds long, which was 3 seconds more than the answer should have required if the answer were comfortable. We're still determining that, Farwell said carefully. Nora closed her eyes, opened them. Is Merritt aware of the DoD connection? She said. Yes. And he didn't lead with that this morning. No. Farwell's voice was quiet. He didn't. She sat with that piece of information, the shape of it, the specific kind of omission it represented. Merritt had seemed straightforward to her. She was fairly good at reading people, and nothing about him had triggered the particular internal alarm she'd learned to trust. But straightforward and complete were not the same thing, and a man running a case this large with this many layers made strategic decisions about what to share with witnesses and when. She wasn't angry about it. She understood it. But she needed to understand it clearly before she walked into a formal deposition and gave testimony that could not be unsaid. Ms. Farwell, she said, why are you calling me without Merritt knowing? A long pause. Because I've watched two other witnesses in this case be pressured into limiting their testimony, Farwell said. One of them was convinced it was for their own protection. The other was told the case needed a narrower scope to succeed. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. Both of them ended up protecting people they didn't mean to protect. I don't want that to happen with you. You're the last clean witness. If your testimony gets shaped before it goes on record... She stopped. In the silence, Nora heard something. It was faint. Below the ambient noise of the apartment building, the ventilation, the distant sound of someone else's television, the creak of the structure settling in the late morning heat. Below all of that, a sound that did not belong. A sound that her body recognized before her conscious mind did, the way it had recognized things in another life that she couldn't afford to be wrong about. Movement. In the hallway outside her apartment door, not the ordinary footstep of a neighbor. Slower, more deliberate, the careful weight distribution of someone who didn't want to be heard. "I'll call you back," she said quietly, and ended the call. She was already on her feet, moving toward the kitchen counter, placing herself out of the direct sight line of the door, her mind doing the fast mechanical calculation of what she had in this apartment that was useful and what she was going to need in the next 30 seconds. The door handle moved, not the knocking of someone who expected to be let in, not the jingle of a key, the slow, testing rotation of someone checking whether a lock was engaged. It was engaged, but the person on the other side of it already knew her name, already knew where she lived, and had arrived within an hour of Crane's 4-minute phone call. And the only person who knew she was here, who knew her actual address, not just the hospital she worked at, was Harlan Merritt. She didn't have a weapon. That was the first concrete fact her mind produced, and she processed it without panic the way she had been trained to process tactical deficits, as a variable, not a verdict. No weapon. Known space. One entry point. She knew the apartment's geometry better than whoever was on the other side of that door, and in a confined space that mattered more than most people understood. She moved to the kitchen and pulled open the second drawer. Utility scissors, a box cutter she used for packages. Not ideal. She took the box cutter and positioned herself against the wall beside the refrigerator, angle set so she could see the door without being visible from the threshold. The handle stopped moving. Silence. 20 seconds of it. Then footsteps. Retreating, unhurried, as if whoever it was had decided the calculation didn't favor them right now or had gotten what they came for simply by confirming she was home. She stayed where she was for 90 seconds after the footsteps faded. Old habit. The second threat was always the one you moved too soon to notice. Then she went to the window and looked down at the street. A gray sedan was pulling away from the curb. She got a partial plate, last 3 digits, Nevada registration, before it turned the corner and was gone. She took a photograph of the empty parking space out of some residual instinct, capturing the corner of the curb and the angle of the turn, because sometimes the absence of a thing was as useful as the thing itself. She called Merritt. He picked up on the second ring. She told him about the door handle, the footsteps, the partial plate. She told him without editorializing in the compressed informational syntax she'd used in field reports a lifetime ago. What happened, in sequence, with the specific sensory details that were verifiable. "Are you injured?" he said. "No, they didn't come in. I'm sending someone to your location." "Before you do that," she said, "I need to know who else had access to my address." A pause. Not a long one, but real. "What do you mean?" "My address. You have it. Rollins has it. Who else on your team?" "Nora." "I'm not accusing you," she said. "I'm asking you a direct question about operational security, and I'd like a direct answer." Another pause, this one more considered. "The address was pulled from the hospital HR system when we were building the personnel files. It's in the case file. 4 people on the task force have access to the full case file." "4 people," she said. "Yes." "And Crane's call went to a Varex Solutions subsidiary at 9:50 this morning. I was placed on administrative leave at 9:40. Whoever came to my door arrived before noon." She did the math out loud deliberately so he could follow it. "That's a 2-hour window between Crane's call and someone showing up at my apartment. That's fast. Either someone moved very quickly based on information Crane provided, or someone already knew my address and only needed the activation." She could hear Merritt's breathing change. Not dramatically, but the rhythm of it shifted. "I'll need to look at the access logs for the case file," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The box cutter was still in her hand. She set it on the counter. The thing she had not said to Merritt, and was not ready to say yet, was this. The footsteps outside her door had retreated too cleanly. No urgency, no adjustment. A person who had tried a door and found it locked and decided to wait was not a person conducting an improvised threat assessment. They were a person executing a plan that had already accounted for this outcome. Come to the door, confirm occupancy, withdraw, report. Which meant whoever sent them wasn't trying to reach her here. They were trying to know where she was. Merritt arrived 40 minutes later with Rollins and a third agent she hadn't met, a young man named Bauer, who said nothing and positioned himself in the hallway outside her apartment with the patient, contained energy of someone who was very good at standing in hallways. Merritt came in and looked at the apartment the way people in his profession looked at spaces, exits, sight lines, the basic tactical inventory, and then he sat down at her kitchen table and put a tablet in front of her. "The access log," he said. 4 people. Me, Rollins, an analyst named Derek Sue, and a liaison from the DOD Inspector General's office named Vincent Prawl. He tapped the screen. Prawl accessed the file at 7:14 this morning. She looked at the timestamp. The hospital meeting with Fenton had been at 9:40. Crane's call at 9:50. Prawl accessed it 90 minutes before any of this happened, she said. "Yes." "Who is he?" "He's been embedded with the task force for 3 months. He's a DOD IG liaison. Standard procedure for a case with military personnel involved." Merritt's voice was careful. "He's also the person who was supposed to be verifying the chain of custody on War's transmitted documents." "Supposed to be," she said. "We can't reach him this morning. He's not responding to calls or messages." She looked at the tablet. Then she looked at Merritt, and she took a careful measure of the man, the lines around his eyes, the particular kind of tired that came from working something long and complicated and watching it develop new fractures in real time. "Adrian Farwell called me," she said. His expression didn't collapse, but it rearranged. "When?" "This morning, before whoever was at my door. She told me there's a current DOD official in War's documentation. Active government. She also told me that 2 other witnesses had their testimony shaped before it went on record." She paused. She didn't mention Prawl by name, but she knew the DOD connection existed. Merritt was quiet for a moment. Rollins, standing near the window, said nothing. "Farwell is solid," Merritt said finally. "She's been on this case from the beginning. If she called you independently, it's because she had a reason." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She's also been concerned about Prawl for 6 weeks. She didn't have enough to make a formal complaint." "Now she might," Nora said. "Now we might have considerably more than a complaint." He stood. "I need to get you out of this apartment. We're moving you to a secure location while we run down the plate and locate Prawl." "I'm not done talking to you," she said. "I know. We can do this at the secure location." "No." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Crane is still in that hospital. Fenton is still in that hospital. Thomas War is being moved, which is good, but the OR staff who treated him, the nurses who had contact with him, they're still there, and they don't know that a false ID tried to access the OR this morning." She looked at him steadily. "And there's something else." "What?" "Crane signed those assessments, but somebody with medical knowledge had to provide the clinical basis for them, had to tell him what to write, or verify that what he wrote was plausible enough to stand up. Someone who understood the injuries well enough to make the case for non-recoverability." She held his gaze. "Crane is a hospital administrator now, but before Harlow Ridge he was a trauma surgeon. He was deployed twice as a civilian contractor with forward surgical units." She paused. "He was in the region during Coldwater Ridge. I didn't know that this morning. I know it now because I've been sitting here thinking about it for 40 minutes. Merritt looked at her. "He wasn't just signing paperwork," she said. "He was there, or close enough to there to know what the injuries looked like." The kitchen was very quiet. "How certain are you?" Merritt said. "Certain enough that if you pull his deployment records from that period, you're going to find a gap, something redacted or classified or conveniently missing." She stood. And if Prawl is the DoD liaison who's been managing what gets verified and what doesn't, that gap has been there by design. Rollins moved away from the window. We need to move now, she said to Merritt, with the tone of someone for whom this was no longer optional. Nora picked up her jacket from the hook by the door, the ordinary jacket in the ordinary apartment. She took one look back at the kitchen, the coffee maker, the bookshelves. Then she walked out, ahead. The secure location was a DOJ-maintained property 20 minutes outside the city, a nondescript house in a residential neighborhood, the kind of place that looked like it belonged to a mid-level accountant and smelled like institutional carpet cleaner. There were 2 agents already inside, a dedicated communication setup in the back room, a coffee maker that worked adequately. She gave her formal statement over the next 4 hours. It was not a comfortable process. Formal depositions with investigators never were, even when you were on the same side, because the process required a particular kind of exposure. You said the thing you knew in the precise language it needed to be said in, and then it existed in the record permanently, and everything that came after was measured against it. She had learned, in the Army, to give debriefs with care. Every word was a commitment. She told them about Coldwater Ridge in the order it happened, the mission parameters, the insertion, the 12 hours of medical operations in the field, the injuries she had treated, the condition of the soldiers at the time the extraction call came. She told them about the 4 men she had personally assessed, who were alive, what their injuries were, what the survivability margins were with field care versus without. She told them that when the extraction order came, she had argued against leaving them. She told them the argument had lasted 6 minutes and she had lost it. Merritt asked careful questions. Rollins documented. A second DOJ attorney named Garland, who had arrived while she was giving the first part of her account, listened without expression and occasionally made notes. At one point, Merritt stopped her. "You said you argued with the officer who gave the extraction order," he said. "Who was that officer?" She'd known this question was coming. She had been moving toward it for the last 40 minutes of testimony, the way you move toward a thing you knew was unavoidable and had decided not to flinch from. "Major David Sutter," she said. "He was the senior officer on site." Garland looked up from his notes. "Sutter," Merritt said carefully. "As in Brigadier General David Sutter, currently Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations." "I don't know his current rank," she said. "The last time I saw him, he was a major. He gave the extraction order. He made the call to leave the 4 men. She kept her voice level. "I filed a formal objection in my debrief. It was in the 47 pages. It was not in the 11 that survived." The room absorbed that. This was the name Farwell had been circling around. Active DOD official. Not a contractor, not a civilian advisor. She could see it in the way Garland held his pen very still, the way Rollins stopped typing for a second and then started again. Merritt leaned back in his chair. He looked like a man who had just seen a map resolve into a shape that was both exactly what he expected and considerably worse. "We need to move on Crane tonight," Rollins said. "If Prawl is compromised and Sutter knows the evidentiary package is complete." "We're not ready," Garland said. "We may not get to ready," Rollins said. "We have a missing DOD liaison, a pre-positioned asset that accessed a witness's apartment, and an original mission officer who is currently in a position to make calls that directly affect this investigation." She looked at Merritt. "How long before someone above us in the chain tries to classify this case?" The question sat in the room like smoke. Nora thought about Thomas War. 4 years of careful, solitary work. The transmission he'd managed before he was shot. The specific choice to come to Harlow Ridge, to find her, to say the 4 words that put everything in motion. "There's something else," she said. They looked at her. "Crane is still on duty at Harlow Ridge. If he knows the evidentiary package is complete, and if Prawl told him, he's going to try to access his own records from that period. Deployment files, medical logs, anything he thinks might be used against him. He's going to try to create distance between himself and the signatures before you can arrest him." She paused. "He has administrative access to the hospital's medical records system. He used it to shape my personnel file here. He can use it to alter records from his previous positions if those records were digitized and if he has the connections to reach them." "Tampering with federal records," Garland started. "Would take him approximately as long as making a phone call," she said. He's been managing this for 5 years. He knows exactly where the vulnerabilities are. Merritt made a decision. She could see it happen. The small visible shift of a man who had been running a deliberate, methodical investigation and was now running a different kind of calculation entirely. "Rollins," he said, "get me a warrant for Crane's workstation and hospital records access. I want it in the next hour." He looked at Nora. "You said Crane was in the building. Is there anything in that hospital, physical, not digital, that he could reach before we get there?" She thought about it honestly, which meant she thought about the hospital the way she'd learned to think about any space she operated in. Access points, storage, the places where important things lived in physical form rather than on a server. "The credentialing office," she said, "on the 3rd floor. Hard copy deployment verification files for all medical staff are kept there for licensing purposes. If his civilian contractor deployment from that period is in those files, he destroys the physical copy," Merritt said. "Yes." He was already on his phone. "Bussin'." What happened next moved faster than formal investigations were supposed to move, which was both necessary and the source of the complications that came afterward. Merritt got the warrant. It took 53 minutes, fast, but the federal judge on rotation had been briefed on the case outline weeks before and understood what was being asked and why. Rollins coordinated with the Hartwell County Sheriff's Office for uniformed backup. 2 additional DOJ agents were pulled from a different location. Nora was not supposed to go to the hospital. That was made clear to her. She went anyway. Not in the federal vehicles, she drove her own car, which meant she arrived 4 minutes before the warrant team because she knew the back entrance to the parking structure and the federal convoy was taking the main approach. She sat in the structure on the 2nd level and watched the main entrance and thought about what she was doing. She was not a federal agent. She had no authority here. She was a nurse on administrative leave who had given a deposition and was technically supposed to be in a safe house 20 minutes away. What she was, underneath that, was the only person in that building who had been inside Coldwater Ridge and come out the other side with a clear accounting of what had happened there. She was the last clean witness, which was what Farwell had called her, and that phrase had a specific weight she couldn't put down. She got out of the car. She used her badge, still active because the hospital's security office processed administrative leave paperwork on a 24-hour delay, and came in through the staff entrance on the east wing. She took the stairs rather than the elevator because elevators were choke points, and she went up to the 3rd floor. The credentialing office was at the end of the administrative corridor. She could see from 20 feet away that the door was open, not the way it was open during business hours, with the lights on and the administrative assistant at the desk. Open the way a door was open when someone had come through it in a hurry. She slowed, moved along the wall. The lights inside the office were on. She could hear movement, the sound of drawers, the papery shuffle of files being moved quickly. She stopped at the door frame and looked in. Elliot Crane was at the far filing cabinet, his back to her, pulling folders and checking contents with the rapid, focused motion of a man who had a specific thing to find and a limited amount of time to find it. He was in his white coat still, which meant he'd come straight from the floor, no time to change. His phone was on the cabinet beside him, screen lit. He hadn't heard her. She stood in the doorframe for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Dr. Crane?" He spun around. The folder in his hand, thick, cream-colored with a printed tab she couldn't read from the door, slipped slightly in his grip. His face went through 3 things in quick succession: shock, recognition, and then something that wasn't quite fear but was its structural cousin. "Voss." His voice was controlled, barely. "You're on administrative leave. You can't be—" "Put the folder down," she said. "You have no authority here. Federal agents are in this building with a warrant for your workstation and your records access history." She kept her voice even, the same voice she used in the trauma bay when a situation needed steadiness more than volume. "The warrant covers physical records in this office. Whatever you're holding, if you remove it from this room before they get here, that's obstruction. That's a separate charge on top of everything else." His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to the phone on the cabinet. "Don't," she said. "Whoever you're planning to call, they're already running. Prawl is missing. The asset who came to my apartment this morning didn't accomplish anything except giving us a partial plate." She paused. The transmission war maid is already in federal custody. The evidentiary package is complete. There's nothing left to suppress. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. The specific recalibration of a man who had been managing a situation for years and had just understood fully that the situation was no longer manageable. "You were a nurse," he said. His voice had gone strange, flat and tight, like someone reading from a script they'd just realized was wrong. "You were supposed to be a quiet, unremarkable nurse." "I know," she said. "That worked out better for me than it did for you." He looked down at the folder in his hands. She watched his face go through the arithmetic of a man calculating odds in real time. Whether he could reach the phone, whether the door had another exit, whether there was any remaining play that got him out of this room in a different condition than he was going to leave it in. He set the folder on top of the cabinet. The sound of footsteps came from the corridor. More than one person, the rapid, purposeful sound of people who knew where they were going. Rollins came through the door first, warrant in hand, with 2 agents behind her and a uniformed deputy from the sheriff's office at the rear. Rollins looked at Crane, then at Nora, then at the folder on the cabinet. "Ms. Voss," she said, in a tone that contained a full conversation's worth of reaction compressed into 3 words. "Please step back." Nora stepped back. She moved to the far wall and watched Rollins take the folder from the cabinet, watched one of the agents begin the formal process of securing the room, watched Elliot Crane stand very still with his hands at his sides, while the deputy read him his rights in a voice designed to be heard clearly and remembered accurately. Crane did not look at her again. He looked at the floor. She understood that. It was easier to look at the floor than to look at the person who had just proven, in the most specific and consequential way, exactly who she was. Merritt found her in the corridor outside 15 minutes later. He looked at her for a long moment. Not angry. She had expected some degree of that and had prepared a measured response to it. But what was on his face was more complicated than anger. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said. "No," she agreed. "Anything you witnessed in that office is potentially subject to challenge on chain of custody grounds." "The folder was on the cabinet," she said. He put it down before Rollins came through the door. She documented it in place. She met his eyes. "I didn't touch anything. I didn't threaten him. I told him what was already true." Merritt was quiet for a moment. "David Sutter," he said. "We've been trying to build a case around him for 14 months without being able to place him in the operational theater. Your testimony puts him on the ground. The folder Crane was pulling. Preliminary check. It's his civilian contractor deployment verification for the relevant period. It would have placed him within 40 miles of the Coldwater Ridge insertion point." She held very still. "He was there," she said. "Merritt. Sutter was there. He wasn't 40 miles away. He was present during the extraction decision. I saw him." Merritt's face did something careful and controlled. "You're saying you can place Sutter physically at the extraction?" "I saw him standing 20 feet from the officer who gave the order," she said. "Major Sutter. He was present. He may have given the order himself. The officer who spoke was using a call sign, not a name. But I saw him." The corridor was very quiet. From inside the credentialing office, the sound of evidence bags being sealed, the formal procedural sounds of an investigation reaching a critical mass. Merritt looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating the weight of something he'd been carrying for a long time. "Sutter is scheduled to brief the Senate Armed Services Committee on Thursday," he said, "in 48 hours. She did the math without needing to. A public confirmation hearing. A room full of cameras and senators and the specific theater of official accountability. A man who had spent 5 years making sure the right things stayed buried, 48 hours away from the kind of moment that made buried things considerably harder to reach. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The number was Adrienne Farwell's. The message was 4 words. They found Vincent Prawl. And below that, a single additional line that made the corridor feel suddenly very small. "He's alive. He's talking." She showed Merritt the message. He read it twice. Something shifted in his posture. Not relief, not yet, because relief required certainty, and they were still several steps from that. but the tight, managed quality of a man who had been holding a structural problem together with insufficient materials and had just been told another support beam was available. "Where?" he said. She called Farwell back. Farwell picked up on the first ring. "Prawl turned himself in," Farwell said without preamble. 20 minutes ago. Federal Field Office in Sacramento. He drove himself." A pause. "He says he was taken off communications by Sutter's people yesterday afternoon, man. Not physically detained, but warned. He was told the case was being reclassified and his participation was being terminated. He was told to stand down and that his access would be revoked." Another pause. "He didn't stand down." "What does he have?" Nora said. 41 months of internal communications between Sutter's office and Varick Solutions. Budget authorizations. Deployment orders with falsified mission parameters. And 3 recordings, phone recordings he made personally, without authorization, over the last 6 weeks. Farwell's voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. Prawl has been building his own parallel file. He didn't trust the formal investigation channel. He thought someone in the chain was managing what reached the prosecution team. "Someone was," Nora said. She looked at Merritt. "He thought it was you." Merritt absorbed that without visible offense, which told her something about him. "He's agreed to full cooperation," Farwell said. "He wants immunity. Garland is on the phone with DOJ right now." "He'll get it," Merritt said, close enough to hear. "Get him into protective custody before Sutter's people figure out where he is." Nora lowered the phone for a moment. The corridor outside the credentialing office was still active, agents moving in and out, the procedural machinery of an arrest scene, Crane presumably somewhere in the building being processed. Through the office doorway, she could see the filing cabinet with its open drawers, the folder that Crane had been holding now sealed in an evidence bag on the desk. 5 years of architecture, she thought. 5 years of careful, layered suppression. And it was coming apart in the span of 12 hours because Thomas War had held on long enough to find her, and she had been exactly who he needed her to be. She put the phone back to her ear. "Farwell, the Senate committee briefing, Thursday." "I know," Farwell said. "We're aware." "What's the play?" A pause. "That's above my level. But Garland has been on the phone with the committee counsel for the last 20 minutes. If Prawl's recordings are what he says they are..." She stopped. "They're not going to let Sutter walk into that hearing room." She hung up. Merritt was looking at her with the expression of a man trying to decide how much to say. "The folder Crane was pulling," he said finally. "Preliminary check confirmed it. His contractor deployment for the relevant period. It puts him in the operational region during the 72-hour window of Coldwater Ridge." He paused. "That combined with your testimony placing Sutter on site, that's the geographic and personnel chain we've needed." "Chain of command," she said. "Sutter ordered it. Crane verified the medical basis. Varick Solutions provided the contractual cover and the financial incentive." "And Prawl's recordings closed the loop," Merritt said. "If they showed direct communication between Sutter's office and Varick after the mission, then the cover-up isn't incidental," she said. "It's coordinated, premeditated. That's conspiracy, not just fraud." Merritt nodded slowly. He looked down the corridor toward the elevators, toward the rest of the building that was still running its ordinary hospital day around the extraordinary thing happening in this administrative wing. "I need you back at the secure location," he said. "I know," she said, and this time she meant it. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the spare room of the safe house and listened to the sounds of the building, the shift changes of the agents outside, the occasional vehicle on the residential street, the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen, and thought about Coldwater Ridge the way she had not let herself think about it in 5 years. Not the tactical details. She'd given those to Merritt in 4 hours of testimony, and she didn't need to replay them. What she was thinking about was the quality of the night, the specific weight of the air, the sound the helicopter made when it lifted without the 4 men who should have been on it. She had run through the math at the time, standing in the field with the rotors pulling away overhead, the kind of math you did when you were trying to find the variable that changed the outcome. There wasn't one. The decision had been made above her pay grade by people who had reasons she wasn't cleared to know, and her 47 pages of objections had been reduced to 11 pages of compliance because that was how the architecture worked when the people at the top of it decided something needed to stay buried. What she had not known then, what she knew now, was that the 4 men left behind had not all died. Thomas War had survived. He had survived and spent 4 years making sure that survival meant something. She thought about that for a long time in the dark. At 4:30 a.m., she gave up on sleep, went to the kitchen, and made coffee. Bauer was on the night rotation outside. He looked through the window when the kitchen light came on and she held up the coffee pot in a question. He shook his head. She made 2 cups anyway and left one on the step for him because she had been the person standing watch in the cold before, and she remembered what a cup of coffee meant when you hadn't been offered one. At 6:15, Merritt arrived. He came in looking like a man who also hadn't slept, which meant they were even. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his phone face up between them and said, "Prahl's recordings cleared authentication. DOJ confirmed at 5 this morning." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "What's in them?" 3 calls. The first 2 are between an aide in Sutter's office and a senior VP at Varick Solutions. They discussed the War situation specifically, by name. They knew War was alive and they knew he was building documentation. The call is from 8 months ago. He paused. The third call is Sutter himself, talking to the Varick VP, talking about the Coldwater Ridge assessments, talking about Crane. His voice stayed even. And talking about you. She looked at him. "He knew you were at Harlow Ridge," Merritt said. "He'd known for 6 months. The call is 4 months old. He says, his exact words, that you're a manageable variable as long as you stay quiet, and that Crane has the situation in hand." Manageable variable. She had been called many things by people who underestimated her, but that particular phrasing had a specific texture. "What changed?" she said. "What made them stop treating me as manageable?" "War," Merritt said simply. "The moment he survived long enough to reach you and transmit the package, the calculation changed. You went from a buried variable to an active threat." He picked up his phone. "The Senate committee has been notified. Sutter's Thursday briefing has been postponed, effective this morning. The committee counsel is in communication with DOJ. He set the phone down. "We're arresting him today." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Crane," she said. "Already processed. He's in federal custody. His attorney is requesting a cooperation agreement." Merritt's expression suggested what he thought of that. "Fenton is being interviewed this morning. Preliminary indication is that her involvement was limited. She was contacted by someone she understood to be a DOD security official and told to place you on administrative leave as a precaution. She may have known more than she's saying, but she's not a primary." "And Sutter?" "Sutter," Merritt said, "is currently in his office in Washington, D.C., because as of an hour ago, he still thinks the case has been contained. He doesn't know about Prahl's cooperation. He doesn't know the recordings authenticated." He looked at her steadily. "He's about to find out." She nodded. She thought about what that moment would look like. A man in a federal office building, behind a desk with the weight of a senior DOD title and 5 years of successful suppression behind him, receiving the specific information that the architecture he'd built had collapsed. She didn't feel satisfaction about it exactly. She felt something more functional than that. The particular sensation of a long-standing structural problem being correctly diagnosed and addressed. "I want to know when it happens," she said. "You'll know," Merritt said. The arrest of Brigadier General David Sutter, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, occurred at 11:23 a.m. on a Tuesday in his own office, with the building's security cameras running and 3 DOJ agents and 2 U.S. Marshals present, and it was not the clean cinematic thing that arrests in official buildings were sometimes described as being. Nora knew the broad shape of what happened from Farwell, who called her at 12:45. Sutter had not gone quietly. Not violently. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who operated through proxies and paperwork and the institutional levers of power. But he had argued. He had cited clearances and classifications and the particular machinery of national security that men in his position sometimes believed insulated them from ordinary procedural accountability. He had made calls. 2 of the calls went through before his phone was taken. Neither call reached anyone in a position to help him. The third agent on scene had recorded the entire sequence on body camera, which was standard procedure and which Sutter had apparently not accounted for. He asked for his attorney, Farwell said. Then he asked who authorized this. Then he said, and I'm reading from the transcript, "You don't understand what Coldwater Ridge protected. You don't understand what those decisions prevented." Nora was quiet. "He actually said that," she said. "On camera," Farwell said. "In front of 3 federal agents and 2 marshals." A pause. His attorney is going to spend the next 6 months trying to contextualize that sentence. She set her phone on the table and looked at the wall of the safe house for a moment. The safe house with its institutional carpet and its adequate coffee maker, and the sound of Bauer moving in the hallway, preparing to rotate off shift. What Sutter had said was the confession of a man who had told himself a story about necessity for so long that the story had become the truth he operated from. The decisions that prevented, as if 4 men left behind in a field, were a cost that had been correctly calculated, a variable properly managed. As if the choice to falsify medical records and suppress witness testimony and build a 5-year architecture of cover-up had been the reasonable response to a difficult situation rather than a crime compounded by additional crimes. She had met men like Sutter before. Not often, but enough. They were not stupid. That was the important thing to understand about them. They were intelligent people who had developed a particular talent for constructing frameworks in which their own interests and the greater good were indistinguishable from each other. She picked her phone back up. "The recording," she said. "War, is he—" "He's out of surgery," Farwell said. "He's been moved to a secure medical facility. He's stable." A pause. "Garland says he's asking about you." She absorbed that. "Tell him—" She stopped. Thought about what Thomas War had done, what it had cost him, what he had held on through to get here. Tell him it worked. The thing she had not anticipated was the public dimension. She had been thinking about the case in terms of its legal architecture. Testimony, documentation, charges, the procedural progression toward a trial that would be complex and lengthy and probably difficult. She had not fully thought through the fact that the arrest of a sitting senior DOD official for conspiracy, fraud, and dereliction of duty connected to a classified special operations mission was not the kind of thing that stayed inside the procedural architecture. By 3 in the afternoon, it had leaked. Not from DOJ, Garland ran a tight office, but from somewhere in the congressional chain that had been notified about the Senate committee briefing being postponed. A reporter at a national outlet had enough sourcing to publish a story that named Sutter, named Coldwater Ridge without full details, named Varick Solutions, and described the broad outlines of the investigation. By 4:30, 2 more outlets had published follow-up pieces. By 6, the story had a shape that was visible from a distance. Senior military official arrested in connection with abandoned soldiers, falsified records, 5-year cover-up. Merritt called her at 6:45. "The hospital put out a statement," he said. "They're distancing from Crane, expressing full cooperation with federal investigators." His tone was dry. Fenton's attorney released a separate statement saying she was deceived by individuals she understood to be acting in official government capacity. "She's not wrong," Nora said. "She was used. That doesn't mean she handled it well, but she was used." Crane's cooperation request has been formally submitted to DOJ. He's offering everything: deployment records, communications with Sutter's office, the names of 3 Varick Solutions employees he was in direct contact with. A pause. "He's also offering to testify about the original medical assessments. He's saying he signed them under pressure." "Was he?" she said. "Under pressure?" "Probably some of both," Merritt said. "He was a contractor in a system that rewarded compliance. That's not an excuse, but it's a context." A beat. "Garland is evaluating the cooperation offer. It depends on whether what he's offering is actually additive at this point." "It might not be," she said. "You have Prahl's recordings. You have the physical folder. You have my testimony." She thought for a moment. "The Varick VP on those calls. Do you have him?" "We will by tomorrow morning," Merritt said. "There are 4 individuals at Varick Solutions connected to the financial documentation War transmitted. Warrants are being processed." She got up and walked to the window of the safe house. The residential street outside was quiet. Evening, a neighbor walking a dog, a sprinkler system running somewhere down the block. The most ordinary possible setting for what she was thinking about. "When can I go home?" she said. "A few more days," Merritt said, "until we've confirmed all the primary actors are in custody or have counsel who've advised them not to do anything stupid." A pause. "Your administrative leave at Harlow Ridge is being rescinded, by the way. Fenton's attorney communicated that this afternoon. You are technically reinstated effective immediately." She thought about trauma too, the nurse's station at 2 in the morning, the particular quality of the night shift, the way time moved differently at 3 a.m. than it did in the daylight hours. "I'll deal with that later," she said. "There's also something else," Merritt said. His tone changed, not dramatically, but enough that she turned away from the window. "The Army is reviewing your discharge," he said. "Officially. The request was initiated this afternoon by the Inspector General's office, based on the evidentiary record. The discharge was characterized as medical. If the review determines the circumstances were coerced, which, given what we have, it almost certainly will," he paused, "your record gets corrected." She stood with that for a moment. Her record. The 47 pages reduced to 11. The psych evaluation that had been weaponized against her. The discharge that had arrived too fast and too clean and had severed her from the identity she'd spent 8 years building. "That's not the same as undoing it," she said. "No," Merritt agreed. "It's not." "But it's something," she said. "It's something," he said. Once, on Wednesday morning, the story became larger. 2 of the soldiers who had been left behind at Coldwater Ridge, the ones who had been recovered through the channels that were never publicly discussed, gave statements to their attorneys, who released them simultaneously to 3 news organizations. The statements were careful and legally precise, but their substance was not. They described what had happened during the extraction, what their injuries had been at the time, and what they had been told, officially, about why the decision had been made. What they had been told did not match the medical assessments Crane had signed. By midday, the story had senators making statements. By early afternoon, 2 members of the Armed Services Committee had called for a formal hearing. By 3 o'clock, the DoD had released a 3-paragraph statement that said very little in very careful language, which was what DoD statements looked like when the institution was still determining what it was allowed to say. Nora watched the coverage on the Safe House television with a complicated mixture of feelings she didn't have clean names for. This was not the quiet procedural resolution she had imagined when she'd walked out of Harlow Ridge yesterday morning. This was loud and public and moving faster than any of the legal architecture could comfortably accommodate, and the people driving it were journalists and senators and attorneys who were operating on their own timelines and their own interests. She understood that all of this was necessary. She also understood that it was going to make the trial more complicated, and the next 6 months of her life considerably louder than she'd planned for. At 4:15, Farwell called. "The Varick VP," Farwell said. "His name is Raymond Galt. He's been taken into custody." A pause. He had a full document shredding operation underway when agents arrived. They got there before the relevant materials were destroyed, but barely. What did he have? The original contract authorizations for Coldwater Ridge, the financial disbursements connected to the falsified assessments, and Farwell paused in the specific way of someone choosing how to deliver a piece of information. Internal communications from 5 years ago, from the 48 hours immediately following the mission. What do they say? They say, specifically, that the decision to leave the soldiers was not a battlefield necessity determination. It was made in advance. The medical non-recoverability framework was prepared before the extraction, not after. The assessments Crane signed were written before he examined anyone. The safe house was very quiet. She had known this, not in the way that was provable, but in the way that came from being present, from understanding the timeline, from the specific speed with which a set of very clean documents had materialized in the aftermath of a mission that should have taken weeks to formally close. She had known it the way you knew things you couldn't yet say out loud. Now it was in writing. In Varick Solutions' own communications. In Raymond Galt's office, rescued from a shredder by approximately 40 minutes. "That's premeditation," she said. "For the abandonment," Farwell confirmed. This isn't a bad decision made in the field under pressure. This was planned. The soldiers were going to be left behind before the mission began. The medical framework was constructed to justify a decision that was already made. Her voice was steady and absolutely cold. Crane didn't just sign falsified records. He participated in constructing the justification for abandoning soldiers who were never going to be extracted regardless of their condition. She sat down. She sat down on the safe house couch and looked at the television, which was running coverage with a chyron she couldn't fully read from where she was sitting, and she thought about Thomas War on that gurney, his grip on her wrist, the 4 years it had taken him to get from a field in the dark to a hospital trauma bay, and 4 words. He had known. Of course he had known. Not the documents, maybe, not the paper trail, but the thing underneath the paper trail, the decision that had been made before anyone set foot on the ground. He had known it the way she had known it, from the inside, from having been present when the machinery of it ran. "When does this reach the court?" she said. "Arraignments are being scheduled. Crane, Sutter, Galt, federal court, likely within the next 2 weeks." Farwell paused. "There will be pretrial hearings, possibly for months. This case is going to be visible for a long time." "I know," she said. "Your testimony is central to the prosecution's case," Farwell said. "I want to prepare you for what that's going to look like. Defense attorneys are going to go after the circumstances of your discharge. They're going to argue that your account is colored by—" "By what?" Nora said. "I know what they're going to argue. I've known since this morning." "By grievance," Farwell said. "They'll characterize you as a disgruntled former soldier with a personal stake in the outcome." "I was there," she said. "I have a personal stake in the truth. That's different from a grievance." "I know that," Farwell said. "The jury needs to know it too." She looked at the television, at the coverage running its loop of official statements and legal analysis, and the particular media machinery that surrounded large federal cases. "I'll be ready," she said. She meant it. She had been ready, in the way that mattered, for 5 years, carrying the weight of what she knew without a structure capable of holding it. Now the structure existed. Now the weight had somewhere to go. She was still watching the television when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, just a number with a local area code. She opened it. "This is Thomas War. Farwell gave me your number. I need to tell you something. Not for the case, for you." She stared at the screen, then she typed back, "I'm listening." The 3 dots of a reply in progress appeared, held, disappeared, then reappeared. They didn't just know about you. They had a file on you, going back 2 years. Before I found you, they knew where you were. They knew what shift you worked. They knew your apartment address. She read it twice. They decided to leave you alone because Crane told them you were contained, that you were quiet enough to ignore. She already knew this. Merritt had told her about Sutter's call, about manageable variable. She waited. The 3 dots appeared again. What Crane didn't tell them is that he'd been managing your file at the hospital. He'd been blocking your performance reviews, keeping you off any advancement track, making sure you stayed exactly where you were, visible enough to monitor, small enough to overlook. Her jaw tightened. "There's a second file, Nora, not in the case materials, not in anything Merritt has. Crane kept a separate record, outside the hospital system. We don't know what's in it. But he handed a physical copy to someone the morning of the day I came in. Before he knew I was going to be brought to Harlow Ridge, someone picked it up at the hospital. We don't know who." She was on her feet. "Someone has a file on you that federal investigators don't know about, and whoever picked it up isn't Sutter, isn't Galt, and isn't anyone we've identified yet." She called Merritt. He answered immediately. "War just texted me," she said. "There's a second file. Crane passed a physical copy to an unknown individual the morning War came in, before any of this started." She kept her voice flat and precise. "Someone is out there who has documentation on me that isn't in your evidentiary record. Someone we haven't identified." The silence on Merritt's end lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Stay in the house," he said. "Who else was Crane in contact with?" she said. "Besides Sutter's people and Varick. Who else?" We're still mapping his communications, Merritt said. There are gaps. Calls to unregistered numbers we haven't traced yet. His voice had the clipped quality of someone who had just moved to a different operational tempo. Nora, stay in the house. She looked at the window, at the ordinary residential street, at the neighbor who was still walking the same dog, or a different neighbor walking a similar one. She couldn't tell from here. There were 3 recorded calls on Prahl's phone, she said. You said 3. Yes. Were they the only ones he recorded, or the only ones he told you about? The silence this time was 3 seconds. I'll call you back, Merritt said, and the line went dead. She stood in the middle of the safe house living room, phone in hand, and understood that the case she had thought was collapsing into resolution was not finished. The architecture she could see, Sutter, Crane, Galt, Varick, was the architecture that had been built to be seen eventually if the pressure got high enough. The kind of structure that could absorb a certain amount of exposure and still protect the center of it. What she was thinking about now was the center, the thing that all of that structure had been built to protect, not the contracts, not the money. Something more fundamental, something that required not just Crane's compliance, but a separate file, a physical copy, handed to an unknown individual at 7 a.m. on the morning that Thomas War arrived in Harlow Ridge Medical Center, which meant someone had known War was coming, not reacted to him arriving, known in advance. She looked at her phone, at War's messages, at the timeline she was now building in her head, the sequence she should have seen earlier and hadn't because she'd been inside the case looking outward rather than outside it looking in. Thomas War had been shot in a parking structure 2 miles from Harlow Ridge. He had survived long enough to be brought to her. He had transmitted the evidentiary package before he was shot, which meant the transmission happened before the shooting, which meant whoever shot him had failed to stop the transmission, which meant whoever shot him had known the transmission was coming, which meant there was a 4th actor, not Sutter, not Crane, not Galt, someone who had been watching War long enough to know his plan and had moved to stop it and had failed by approximately 20 minutes, and that someone had received a physical file from Crane on the morning of the shooting. She sat down again. Her hands were steady. Her mind was running the variables with the clean mechanical precision she had learned in a different life and never fully stopped using. The 4th actor had the file. They knew what was in it. They knew her name, her address, her shift schedule, and 2 years of documented behavior that Crane had been compiling on her specifically. They had failed to stop War. They had sent someone to her apartment, and that had failed. They had not, as far as she knew, made a 3rd move. The question was not whether they would. The question was what they were waiting for. Her phone lit up. Not Merritt, not Farwell, not War. A number she had never seen before. Local area code, different from War's. She stared at it for 3 full seconds. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, the accent a flat Midwestern American that had been smoothed by years of professional environments. She did not recognize it. Ms. Voss, the voice said, I think it's time we spoke directly, before this gets any further out of hand for either of us. She did not put the call on speaker. She did not move toward the door or the window. She stood exactly where she was in the middle of the safe house living room and kept her voice at a normal register, because whoever this was had called her on a number they shouldn't have had, which meant either the safe house line had been compromised or they had access to her personal phone's routing, and in either case, showing alarm served her nothing. I don't know who you are, she said. My name is Conrad Hale. A pause. I'm a senior managing partner at a defense consulting firm called Meridian Group. We've worked with Varick Solutions on several contracts over the past 8 years. I think you understand what that means. She understood exactly what it meant. Meridian Group was the center she had been trying to identify, the layer beneath Varick Solutions, the thing that the visible architecture had been built to protect. A consulting firm was cleaner than a contractor, more removed from operational specifics, the kind of entity that appeared in financial records as a line item rather than a participant. Why are you calling me? She said. Because David Sutter is in custody, and Raymond Galt is in custody, and Elliot Crane is cooperating with federal prosecutors, Hale said. His voice was steady in the way of someone who had decided that steadiness was the only remaining tool available to them. And because the file I received from Dr. Crane yesterday morning is, in the current environment, a liability rather than an asset. She absorbed that. You had someone at my apartment, she said. I had someone confirm your location, he said. Nothing more. I want to be clear about that. You had someone at the hospital with a false ID trying to access the OR, she said. I'd like you to be clear about that too. A silence. That was a precautionary measure that I have since determined was an error in judgment. She almost said something sharp. She didn't. What do you want, Mr. Hale? I want to discuss a resolution, he said. The file Crane gave me contains personal documentation on you, your movements, your schedule, 2 years of behavioral observation that he compiled without your knowledge. I am prepared to surrender it to federal investigators, along with certain communications between Meridian Group and Varick Solutions that are not currently in the evidentiary record, in exchange for consideration of my cooperation. She kept her face neutral even though no one could see her face. He was not calling to threaten her. He was calling to negotiate. The distinction was important. A man who was calling to threaten her would not have identified himself by name. Conrad Hale had decided that the architecture was finished, that the people he'd relied on to insulate him were either in custody or actively cooperating against him, and that his best remaining move was to get ahead of the federal case before the federal case got to him. He was also calling her instead of Merritt, or Garland, or Farwell, which meant he believed she had standing that the investigators didn't. The standing of the person who had been most directly harmed, whose testimony was most central, whose cooperation or lack thereof shaped what came next. He was not entirely wrong about that. Mr. Hale, she said carefully, I'm not a prosecutor. I don't make cooperation agreements. No, he said. But you're the last clean witness. Everyone in that case knows it. What you say about the scope of what you experienced, what you're willing to put on record, matters. A pause. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to tell the truth completely, which includes the fact that my firm's involvement was financial and advisory. We did not participate in operational decisions. We did not know soldiers would be left behind. Did you know the medical assessments were falsified? She said. The silence was 4 seconds long. I knew the assessments were produced quickly, he said. I did not ask questions about how. That's not the same as not knowing, she said. Another silence, longer. No, he said, and his voice had changed. The negotiating surface of it had worn through slightly, and underneath was something more honest and considerably less comfortable. It's not. She stood in the safe house living room, phone against her ear, and thought about what it meant that this man had called her. Not the legal dimensions. She would get to those. But the human dimension, the way people in systems of organized wrongdoing almost never thought of themselves as the person doing wrong. They thought of themselves as the person managing complexity, making pragmatic decisions, operating within frameworks that others had built, and that existed independently of them. Conrad Hale had not left 4 men in a field. He had funded and advised and looked away, which was a different thing, and also not a different thing at all. Give me your number, she said. I'm going to call you back in 10 minutes. She hung up. Then she called Merritt. He answered before the first ring finished. I was about to call you. We found a 4th number in Crane's communications, registered to a shell company that traces to Meridian Group, she said. Conrad Hale. He just called me. The silence on Merritt's end lasted 1 second. On your personal phone? Yes. Where is he? I don't know. He called me. I have a callback number. She read it to him. He wants to cooperate. He says he has communications between Meridian and Varick that aren't in the current record. He also has the physical file Crane passed him yesterday morning. The file on you? Yes. She could hear Merritt moving, the sound of the operational environment around him shifting into a different gear. Don't call him back until I've traced the number. Give me 8 minutes. He's not running, she said. He called me. If he was running, he wouldn't have identified himself. 8 minutes, Merritt said, and hung up. She set her phone on the table and sat down. 7 minutes and 40 seconds later, Merritt called back. Number traces to a hotel in downtown Hartwell, he said. He's 12 minutes from your location. A pause. He came here, Nora. He flew in this morning. She thought about that. A man who flew to the city at the center of the investigation and called the primary witness from a hotel room was a man who had already made his decision and was executing it. He wasn't negotiating, he was surrendering in the specific way of someone who wanted to control the terms of the surrender. "I want to be in the room," she said. "Absolutely not," Merritt said. "He called me," she said. "Not you, not Garland, me. He believes I have standing in this conversation, and he's not entirely wrong. If you send agents to that hotel without me, he lawyers up, and the communications he's offering go into a 6-month discovery process. If I call him back and tell him to come in, Nora." "He comes in tonight," she said, "with the file and the communications. Because he trusts that I'll tell the truth about what he is and what he isn't, which is what I was going to do anyway." She paused. "I'm not offering him anything. I'm offering him the chance to tell his own story before someone else tells it for him." A long pause. "You're not an investigator," Merritt said. "No," she said. "I'm the last clean witness. There's a difference." Another pause. She could hear him thinking, the specific sound of a careful man measuring risk against outcome. "You call him," Merritt said finally. "You tell him to come to the federal field office. I'll have agents at the hotel as a precaution, but if he's moving voluntarily, we let him move." A beat. "And you don't meet with him alone. You come to the field office and you're behind glass. You don't go in the room." "Agreed," she said. She called Hale back. He answered immediately. "Federal field office," she said. "Tonight. Bring the file and every communication you have between Meridian and Varick. Come alone." She paused. "This is the only call I'm making on your behalf. After tonight, what happens is between you and the prosecutors." A silence. Then, "All right." She hung up. Mutt. Conrad Hale walked into the federal field office at 8:47 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had rehearsed composure until it became a kind of armor. He was 63, silver-haired, with the physical bearing of someone who had operated in rooms of institutional power for decades. He sat down across from Merritt and Garland and placed the briefcase on the table and opened it without being asked. Nora watched through the observation glass with Farwell beside her. The file was there, the physical copy, Crane's 2 years of documentation on her. She watched Garland open it and page through it, and she kept her face still. The contents were what War had described: shift schedules, apartment address, a documented behavioral profile with annotations in Crane's handwriting, 2 years of being watched by someone she worked 12 feet from, who had smiled at her in the corridor and dismissed her in the trauma bay, and the whole time had been building a record designed to be used against her if she ever became a problem. She had always known she was underestimated. She had not known she was cataloged. The communications Hale surrendered were more significant than the file. 41 months of correspondence between Meridian Group and Varick Solutions, including 3 exchanges that preceded Coldwater Ridge by 6 weeks. Garland read 2 of them and looked up at Merritt with the expression of someone who had just found the structural beam that held the entire case together. Hale spoke for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Nora listened to all of it. He was telling the truth. She was good enough at reading people to be confident of that. Not because truth had a recognizable texture in people who were accustomed to managing it, but because Hale was past the point where anything other than truth served his interests, and he was intelligent enough to understand that. He told them about Meridian's role in structuring the Varick contracts. He told them about the conversations in which the operational parameters of Coldwater Ridge had been discussed. He told them what he knew about the decision to falsify the medical assessments and what he claimed he didn't know. And the line between those 2 things was thinner than he wanted it to be and thicker than the worst version of the story would have it. He had not ordered soldiers to be left behind. He had created the financial framework in which leaving them became a rational choice for the people who had the operational authority to make it. That was a distinction with legal significance. Whether it was a distinction with moral significance was a question she set aside, because it wasn't her question to answer tonight. At 11:15 p.m., Garland suspended the interview to confer with DOJ. Hale sat with his attorney and his empty briefcase. Merritt came out to the observation room. He looked at Nora for a moment. "The communications he brought in," he said. "There's a pre-mission exchange between a Meridian senior advisor and Sutter's office. It discusses extraction contingencies." He paused. It discusses the possibility that certain personnel would not be extracted and frames it as an acceptable operational outcome given the contract parameters. Before the mission, she said. 6 weeks before, he said. She turned back to the glass. Hale was talking quietly to his attorney. An ordinary-looking man in a good suit who had helped design a framework in which 4 men were expendable and had spent 5 years not thinking about it very much, and now was sitting in a federal building at 11 at night because the last clean witness hadn't stayed small the way everyone had planned. Is it enough? She said. It's more than enough, Merritt said. For Sutter, for Galt, for Crane, whatever his cooperation agreement ends up looking like. He paused. For Hale, we'll see. His attorney is going to argue advisory distance. Garland will argue that's not distance enough. He looked at her. He's right. She nodded. Go get some sleep, Merritt said. You've done everything you came to do. She looked at him. At the observation room, the institutional walls, the fluorescent light doing what fluorescent lights did. She thought about the morning this had started. Trauma 2, the 3 a.m. quiet, a man's hand on her wrist, and 4 words that had unlocked 5 years of buried weight. Not quite everything, she said. The formal arraignments took place over the following 11 days. David Sutter was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, dereliction of duty, and obstruction of justice. The arraignment was covered by every major news organization and several international outlets, and the footage of a brigadier general in civilian clothes walking into a federal courthouse ran on a continuous loop for the better part of 2 days. He entered a not guilty plea through his attorney and was released on a bond that required surrender of his passport and travel restrictions to the continental United States. Raymond Galt was charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, and destruction of federal records. He was not released on bond. Elliot Crane accepted a cooperation agreement that reduced his charges in exchange for full testimony. He would serve time. The length of it was still being negotiated, and she tried not to spend too much energy thinking about what the right number was, because that was not her calculation to make, and she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that certain kinds of justice had to be trusted to the processes designed to deliver them, even when those processes were imperfect themselves. Conrad Hale was charged with conspiracy and aiding and abetting. His attorney filed a cooperation motion the same day. The outcome of that was pending, which was the legal system's way of saying, wait. Doris Fenton was not charged. The investigation concluded that she had been deceived about the nature of the contact from Sutter's office and had responded by following what she believed was official guidance. She had not behaved well, but she had not behaved criminally, and Nora had given that assessment when Garland asked her for it, because accuracy mattered more than her personal feelings about Doris Fenton, and her personal feelings about Doris Fenton were more complicated than simple. The Army's review of her discharge concluded in 3 weeks. She received a letter, official, formatted with the precision of institutional language, informing her that her discharge characterization had been reviewed and found to have been improperly influenced by parties who had material interest in suppressing her testimony. The discharge was reclassified. Her service record was corrected to reflect the full 47 pages of her debrief. The commendations that had been redacted were restored. She read the letter twice, sitting at her kitchen table, in the apartment she had come back to after 6 days in the safe house. The coffee maker on the counter, the jacket on the hook by the door. She felt something she didn't have a name for immediately. It wasn't joy, exactly, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't the clean resolution she might have imagined before she understood how complicated resolution actually felt in practice. It was more like recognition, the specific sensation of something that had been named wrong for a long time finally being named correctly. She had been told she was a manageable variable. She had been cataloged and monitored and administratively suppressed and discharged through a process designed to make her small and quiet and dismissible. And none of it had worked, not ultimately, not in the way that mattered, not because she was exceptional, not because she had done something heroic in the storybook sense, but because she had simply kept being exactly who she was in every room she entered, and it turned out that was the thing they couldn't account for. They had planned for a nurse. They had not planned for what was underneath the nurse.